the original phenotype, dark skin with strong curly hair, and a few Sephardic Jews here and there. The social status of being biracial became massive in each tribe. We're headed into the National Archives just to read the annotation for the microfilmed records pertaining to early censuses. You have to know where to look for the evidence of it happening. Taking a look at one of those microfilms from the National Archives, we can see how race was counted for Carroll County, Georgia. This book is saying that the vast majority of slaves in Georgia did not get brought in from other states.
Wake up out of your sleep.
Are you aware that American Indians weren't even identified in the first 5 censuses? Mind you, the first census was in 1790. So that brings us as far as 1840 without any reliable attempt to keep track of the indigenous population. Coincidentally, renowned Euro-American demographer J. David Hacker found in 2020 that the assumed birth rate for the colored population in early American history was not only a biologically impossible feat of human procreative power in the 1800s, but also that it peaked at its most impeccable rates from 1800 to 1840. Those are the same decades during which American Indians weren't being recorded on the census. Coincidence? I think not. We're going to examine what makes these things important in the great debate about how indigenous the Negro is. We're also going to discuss what it all really means for the national Abo community at large, both registered Native Americans and unrecognized Indians alike. Spoiler alert, Native American ancestry is a mix of ours with that of Europeans. They're no more Mongolian than we are, because ancient Turco-Mongolic society was swarthy with tightly wound, curly hair. But Black American heritage predominantly stems from Indians who did not mix, I repeat, did not mix with whites. Now, why does it matter that American Indians weren't identified in the first 5 censuses? What do we even mean when we say that? You have to remember that Indians were historically not considered U.S. citizens because their tribes were viewed as sovereign enemy nations. If you were a member of one of those tribes, your tribal citizenship inherently meant you weren't an American citizen. You lived in a completely different country called something like Navajo Territory or Dakota or Cherokee Territory. Gradually, though, American Indians became U.S. citizens through a variety of factors. Firstly, most tribes were displaced from their original lands at one point or another, but the leadership of each tribe was assimilating with Euro-American society, as in doing what the white man does. In each case, this core leadership was always predominantly comprised of biracial Indians. The social status of being biracial became massive in each tribe because those were the Indians who could navigate both communities, learn both languages, and negotiate with the pale face on what seemed like equal footing. The colonizers seemed to have more respect for mixed Indians than for full-bloods. Those mixed Indians are the ones who negotiated treaties with the United States and repeatedly ceded land. Meanwhile, the full-bloods were the ones who kept the original phenotype, dark skin, with strong curly hair. These full-bloods often refused to leave their original lands when the mixed leadership led everyone to new territory. I covered the Cherokee example of this in a previous video, which I'll include on the outro screen at the end of this one. Go watch that video to understand how it happened. The biracial Indians were trying to live like white people. They adopted things like land ownership, communal school for kids instead of parents teaching their own children, learning to worship Jesus, using slaves to cultivate cotton and sugar, and whatever crops the white man would pay for, making multiple households dependent on a single workforce for its resources. The full-bloods didn't want to assimilate with Euro-American culture, though. They wanted to teach their own children and settle whatever land was convenient for their lifestyle. They rarely owned any slaves, and they caught their own fish. They cultivated crops for their own sustenance only. They hunted animals for their own food. They worshipped existence herself, which is the great spirit who owns the primordial soup from whence living organisms sprung, the same great spirit who created all the elements, including the sacred wind, the breath that sustains you until it leaves. The only entity all tribes worshipped was existence. When the mixed Indians signed treaties with the United States and agreed to give up their land to Euro-Americans, full-bloods usually didn't abide by the treaty. They stayed behind when the rest of the tribe left, and they remained on the land as white people moved in and started building forts, towns, and suburbs. As whites continued to build, the territory they were developing would become a federally recognized state, and the U.S. government would give it a name like Utah, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, Vermont, or something like that. The full-bloods of the tribes that had been there were still living on the land when whites started building and dwelling around them, but then a census would be taken of the new territory and full-blood Indians would be counted in that census. This means Indians who weren't included in the previous census would randomly just pop up on a subsequent census, making it look like the Indian population of the United States is just randomly getting bigger and bigger. And how were they classified? Racially. Their category on the census was just called colored. We're headed into the National Archives just to read the annotation for the microfilmed records pertaining to early censuses. Pay attention to what the first couple sentences tell you. Quote, prior to 1900, few Indians are included in the decennial federal census. Indians are not identified in the 1790 to 1840 censuses. In 1860, Indians living in the general population are identified for the first time. End quote. So this is confirmation of the fact that, well, A, Indians weren't being counted on the early censuses. And B, Indians were gradually getting counted more and more in the mid-19th century. It doesn't say no Indians were counted before 1900. It says few Indians were counted. Okay, so the thing is that the bulk of Indians who did get counted were being classified as coloreds, but in the next century, coloreds started identifying as African Americans. So today the government has confused itself about who we are because when they see colored they think African instead of Indian. Euro-Americans have forgotten what they meant by colored. They've forgotten that they used to call Indians Negroes. Taking a look at one of those microfilms from the National Archives, we can see how race was counted for Carroll County, Georgia at the time of Indian removal. This microfilm specifically comes from US Gen Web Archives, and the file we're viewing is a copy of census taker Benjamin Merrill's count. This copy belongs to Gen Web genealogist Wally Smith, who provides his own annotation with the file. Reading his annotation, Smith says, quote, the 1830 U.S. Census for Carroll County, Georgia, was the first census for Carroll County. It was enumerated by Benjamin Merrill on the 25th of November, 1830. He shows a total population of 3,419, including 1,430 white males, 1,293 white females, 244 male slaves, 244 females, 111 free-colored males, 27 free-colored females. It appears that the free-colored people counted were mostly Native Americans. This is unusual and provides some rare data about some of our first Americans. They were all listed on the last 2 pages of the record, end quote.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen. join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
So, the free colored people here were reportedly Native Americans, but in 1830, the only reason a census taker would list someone as colored was if they literally had color in their skin, or at least the hair grade commonly found among colored people. So, the only Indians left in Carroll County, Georgia, as of 1830, were dark-skinned Indians. Why would that be? Because removal kicked into high gear as of 1825 for Creek Indians and lasted till 1837, give or take. And Georgia was the first frontier Creek Indians lost even before the Alabama territories. This 1830 census was taken halfway through that process. What does that mean? It means biracial Creek Indians, and their white or full-blood family members in the area had all been removed already. But the full-blood Creeks had resisted assimilation and remained on their isolated settlements, away from the towns that were Europeanizing, so they were left behind when removal happened. My paternal grandmother descends from this Aboriginal Georgia community that stayed put straight through the removal period. The full-blood Creeks were dark-skinned people, and their hair naturally grew in a tight curl pattern. You know, the mixed Creeks looked more like what you would now think of when you envision light brown Latino people, but they wouldn't cut their hair. This is why I keep reminding you that renowned historian Jack D. Forbes thoroughly documented the use of the word Negro in reference to Indians. It's because the full-blood Indians were indeed Negroes. The phenotype everyone associates with Native Americans today is a product of Negroes mixing with Europeans for multiple generations. In an essay entitled The Use of Racial and Ethnic Terms in America, Management by Manipulation, Forbes explained, quote, "The 1800, 1810, 1820, and 1830 United States censuses use the free person of color category for most non-whites, including Indians. Thus, the native families of Robeson County, North Carolina, and all Virginia counties are always classified as colored persons. There were only 3 non-whites to speak of here: Africans, Indians, and a few Sephardic Jews here and there. There were occasionally European Moors entering the country and adding to this demographic also, but they came in negligibly small numbers. So Forbes is confirming for us that Indians were being classed as colored during the Indian removal era, and he even gave us a lot more counties as examples of places where this can be observed. I pointed out the Georgia example, though, because it relates directly to my own people, but also because it demonstrates that this wasn't just an East Coast thing. Also, don't forget, Jack D. Forbes is the foremost pundit on all things pertaining to Native American history, and he himself was Native American. That's why citing his indefatigably prolific works on the subject hold a lot of weight here. Also notice that Wally Smith, the genealogist that wrote the annotation on that microfilm, said it was unusual for Indians to get classified as persons of color. Jack D. Forbes flat out disagrees with Wally on that. Forbes is basically saying it happened pretty often, but you have to know where to look for the evidence of it happening, because we don't often have observable proof in every county or state anymore. Wally only said that because his perspective is emblematic of the Euro-American confusion on all this today. They've changed how they view color over the years, so today's whites struggle to get into the heads of yesterday's whites when it comes to sizing up the features of colored peoples. Today, the Census Bureau counts white, black, Native American, and Asian or Pacific Islander as 4 separate races. But notice that the 1860 census mentions the colored race as though there's only one. This perfectly exemplifies the disparity in perspectives I was talking about between white people across different centuries. But it also illustrates that black and Native American were viewed as interconnected. They were considered one colored race because they were really the same people. And since there was no no meaningful Asian presence in the population, there was basically just one colored race. In the early 1800s, some whites understood Native Americans as mixed people and blacks as Indians. However, no one in the general public had access to census data like we do now, so no one had any idea what the ratio was of Africans to Aborigines among all the black people they saw, whether slave or free. That's where the confusion began. Whites are just as confused as we are, and obviously they're the literal authors of confusion on this. Even more confusion enters the picture when we bring up slave breeding, because there's a mystery about how much slave breeding actually happened, as well as how often white slave owners impregnated black slaves. In a recent video, I did a whole presentation on how slave trade math proves that we're Indians. We compared how many slaves from Africa disembarked in mainland North America with the census numbers, and got expert opinion from a demographic historian saying the growth rate of our population during the 1800s was almost biologically impossible, and that it wasn't even reliably recorded in the 1700s. Well, another source I cited in that presentation was a book entitled Slavery, Rice, Culture, Low Country, Georgia, 1750 to 1860. I just want to revisit what we read there because there's actually a lot more meat on those bones. First of all, the example we're given for slave breeding here reports that only 10% of the increase for the slave population came from importing the slaves of other states. This suggests 90% comes from breeding, and people typically assume the breeding was with the white master. However, this book strongly implies that the breeding was done by forcing certain slaves to copulate with one another and thereby reproduce. It's highly likely that this 90% is fully indigenous offspring of Aboriginal slaves from disparate tribes of various states, since they weren't brought in from other states. Think about it. Most states are landlocked, and the primary slave ports were only in either Louisiana or Virginia. Pretty much all other states would have to get their African slaves transported from Louisiana or Virginia. This book is saying that the vast majority of slaves in Georgia did not get brought in from other states, even though Georgia didn't regularly receive slaves by ship either. So most slaves in Georgia would have had to have been indigenous to Georgia, and the book is saying only 10% of the increase in the slave population there came from imported slaves. Almost anyone reading that today will still assume that the rest of the new slaves still must have been from Africa somehow, and they won't stop to notice the fact that that's impossible. The new slaves were predominantly born in Georgia to parents who were also slaves from Georgia. That being said, we do still have to concede that any number of those enslaved parents could have been from Africa, and this statement would still be true. Remember, even though we intend to substantiate the indigenous identity of black people, we discredit ourselves if we don't also admit that African slaves had to be in the mix somewhere. It's just that the overall population of colored people had to be predominantly Aboriginal, with sparse sprinklings of Africans here and there. Bottom line, expert demographers agree that the colored population grew at a practically impossible rate leading up to emancipation, and slave breeding doesn't even come close to explaining how this could be attributable to African slaves. Logic dictates that the astronomical birth rate referred to by Dr. Hacker himself as an assumption was actually a gradual addition of full-blood Indians to the census as their bands were being removed and as tribal territories became U.S. property.